Hello, and thank you very much for taking 45 minutes out of your day to join this webinar on valuing impact through natural capital management. We're thrilled to have a terrific group of attendees from across Europe and North America. I'm Jonathan Shopley from Natural Capital Partners, and I'm joined by, in the order in which they will present, and as you see their pictures on the slide, Mark Goff, Executive Director of the Natural Capital Coalition, Neil Beaufoy, Founder and CEO of the Paradigm Project, and Ellen Upton, Principal Consultant at Thesis. Before I hand over to them, some context on this webinar. Paul Hawken, Hunter and Amy Lovin's book, Natural Capitalism, published back in 1999, articulated a new industrial revolution. Their thesis was that abundant resources and limited labor drove the first industrial revolution. Our new reality of significantly reduced and degraded natural resources with ample labor defines a new pattern of scarcity that will turn our incumbent economic model on its head. Our origins go back to the late 1990s also, when we launched as Future Forest, offering individuals the opportunity to compensate for their greenhouse gas emissions by part funding new forest creation in the UK. We transformed to the carbon neutral company in 2006 and then last year to Natural Capital Partners. And back in 2006, we were working internationally, primarily for businesses using market-based instruments to reach their greenhouse gas emission targets. Through that work, especially over the last decade, we've observed corporations taking a deep strategic interest in the natural capital revolution put out there by Hawken and Lovins. Carbon offset, of course, is all about flows, the work that we did, of greenhouse gas emissions. Natural capital is about stocks of ecosystem assets that maintain a flow of vital life and economic support services. The aha moment for me was when I visited a reforestation project in Kenya with a carbon neutral retailer, and they remarked that the sequestration mechanism of the trees was important, but the most interesting aspect of the project was its potential to protect the very ecosystems upon which their tea supply chain in this instance depended, and were being negatively impacted due to climate impacts in the region. In the world beyond carbon finance, a number of progressive corporates were beginning to take their own first steps to valuing natural capital using this simple matrix. To chart some of those, first notable was Puma in the top left, developed its environmental P&L showing its reliance or debt to natural capital in clear financial terms. And then Dow, on the other side of the Atlantic, took a very different angle and has used natural capital concepts to more directly value the provisioning functions of natural capital, and in doing so has identified $2 billion of savings to their operating budgets by 2020. Nestle, with its No Nature, No Nestle, clearly qualified rather than quantified the value of natural capital. And Sky's Rainforest Rescue Project here in the UK, alongside its carbon neutral program, recognized the intangible value of ecosystem resilience. And finally, for those of you in the UK may recognize George Monbiot's picture in the bottom right, an outspoken critic of any and all efforts to monetize the intangible and immeasurable value of nature. So when the Natural Capital Coalition, Mark's organization, was formed and developed its protocol, we were really keen to put it to use to see what we can learn about how natural capital concepts can be used in corporate strategies to value and enhance natural capital. We took as our departure point a carbon mitigation project in Kenya developed by the Paradigm Project. That's Neil's outfit. We linked up with Thesis, Ellen's consulting operation, with whom we've done interesting measurement and valuation work, and signed up to test the natural capital protocol in its pilot exercise. So having set the scene for what I'd like to do is to hand over to Mark. The agenda now will be to hand over to Mark to introduce the Natural Capital Coalition and protocol, then to Neil to talk a little bit about the carbon project that was the focus of our pilot exercise, and then finally to Ellen to talk about the process and the learnings from the Natural Capital Protocol exercise. We're going to have time for questions, and if you'd like to ask a question, you can do so throughout the presentation via the question tab on the control panel on your screen. Just type in the question, don't forget to press send, and we'll collect these through the presentation and add them to the Q&A. Mark, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and welcome everyone to the webinar today. Looking through the list of participants that are on the call, I'm aware that most of you know some things around what we are doing at the Natural Capital Coalition, so I won't be going into a great deal of detail over some of the projects that we're doing, but more giving you an update on where we are at the moment. So if you can move to the next slide. I did just want to take the opportunity to highlight the number of different initiatives and organizations that are involved in the work that the Coalition is doing, and some of you on the call will recognize your organizations in this slide already on the screen. The point of the Coalition, as you will remember, was to try and bring together a systems thinking approach around natural capital, and that has led to the first project that we've been focusing on, which is the harmonization of the existing methods and approaches that are out there in the Natural Capital Protocol. The Coalition is made up of what we refer to as 7 worlds, which includes the NGOs, civil society and conservation groups, which have been setting out why we should be doing this for some time now. It also includes research and science and academia, who come up with some of the solutions. Then businesses, who we see as being the engine of change, very much so in this process. They're helped by membership organizations such as WBCSD and BSR to make sense of the work that they're doing and to bring that to sector initiatives. Then we also have standard setters, including all of the major ones that you'll be familiar with, GRI, the International Integrated Reporting Council, SASB, CDSB. That also leads to finance, and we have not just individual finance organizations, but also organizations such as UNEP-FI and the Natural Capital Declaration. And one of the next projects that we'll be doing will be looking at the bridge between business and finance with the development of a financial sector guide. And finally, linking up to policy and to some of the government and policymakers. And I think all of this is brought together very well in a project which we are just coming to the end of, in fact, in Colombia. And we will be reporting back on some of the results from this so far next week at the 3GF conference in Copenhagen. And in Colombia, what we've been doing is looking at how the financial system comes together, particularly around the coffee sector and what investment is going in, then how the coffee sector is reacting to its use, particularly of water in Colombia, and how the coffee sector is connected, particularly through Nespresso, who was another one of our piloting companies. Then after that, we're also then looking through at how that connects with the rest of the community, then all the way through to policy. So you can see that that systems thinking approach is extremely relevant. If we can move on to the next slide. So the Natural Capital Protocol and sector guides have been through consultation. We had over 50 companies pilot it, including the Natural Capital Partners and Thesis and the people that are on the phone today as one of them. And the protocol has now been finalized. We're just going through the final layout, and it will be launched on the 13th of July in London. We then have several other opportunities where we will be engaging with different communities around the world, including the World Conservation Congress in Hawaii, Let's Talk Business in the Netherlands, and various others at different spots through the events calendar for the rest of this year. The protocol and sector guides are just the beginning, though, and if we move on to the next slide, it is once again about the systematic approach. And although it's really important that the protocol, this harmonization, a standardized framework that we can all follow for natural capital, is in place, we also need to take account of how data and the information that goes into these systems that we use. and also that broader enabling environment. And we have programs of work that we will be developing further to try and work through collaboration, as we do already, to try and address some of these issues. And obviously with the outreach and advocacy, having over 200 organizations coming together now through the coalition, we have a very long reach into different areas where we can talk about what natural capital means, not just to businesses, but to all levels of society. That was all I was going to cover for now, and I believe I'm handing now back to you, Jonathan, or over to Neil.
Yes, that's very, thank you, Mark. It's really very brief. Just to thank you for that overview, and now to hand on to Neil, and just to talk a little bit about the project and the work that you do that was subject to our pilot exercise. Neil, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. You can move to the next slide as well. I'm just going to give you a little bit of context. The Paradigm Project is a social business that was started in 2008 with the goal of leveraging business as a tool to alleviate poverty. And because of the various backgrounds and experience of the partners, the way we ended up choosing to do that was through projects that deliver basic needs goods, like efficient stoves, water filters, water tanks, solar lights, to families at the base of the pyramid, and then to use carbon finance as a tool to help those projects grow and scale. And we got involved in the Natural Capital Protocol pilot. We were invited to be involved by Jonathan because we develop unique projects that they generate multiple impacts related to the Sustainable Development Goals, and we really wanted to find a way to properly value them and to communicate about them. So if you go to the next slide, to give you a little bit closer view on what we do, there's three things that we're engaged in that were part of this process. One, we develop last mile supply chains on the ground. So we're literally building physical supply chains to move product to customers and in an efficient manner. Those supply chains don't exist today for the most part. We also sell high impact products through those supply chains, a large number of which are clean energy products which whose use generates, among other things, a significant amount of GHG emission reductions. And then we finance our growth through the sale of carbon offsets on the back of monitoring and measuring those emission reductions. And that last one, our work with carbon, has really traditionally defined our impact value, but it's done so in a very restrictive terms. In other words, we really wanted a deeper and broader way to communicate our value to prospective SDG investors and carbon buyers alike. Go ahead to the next slide if you would. So one of the advantages we had coming into this is a slide that just shows a draft form of valuation, a starting point, if you will, for this process that we went through. And then Ellen will be speaking to a little bit more of that process, and ultimately the outcomes that come out of that collaboration will go back into this framework to talk about how our projects and our business impacts the SDG goals. But one of the advantages we really had is that carbon requires a very high degree of tangible monitoring. It has a very rigorous auditing process. And so we were already engaged in the collection of a lot of data. And this is a mix of some of the data that comes naturally from that carbon process, plus some of the valuations from Gold Standard, which is one of the primary methodologies that we use to bring those offsets to market. And it gives you an idea of what we're trying to do. The ultimate goal was to, and is to, create a valuation for each of the SDG goals and an overall valuation that says for every dollar that's invested in Paradigm or into a project, X amount of dollars in value comes out in the form of, you know, clean energy, clean water, gender equality, etc. And so you can imagine that that was quite a challenge. And I think one of the biggest things to keep in mind is that although we piloted this protocol with a business that outputs positive impacts or net positive impacts, the same math and the same process applies to businesses trying to quantify some of the impacts they're having on the use of some of these natural capital aspects. So I think in going through that pilot, a lot of what we learned would apply to any kind of business, even if it's not a social business, generating these surplus, if you will, of impacts. So I think that gives a good framework, and be happy to answer questions after we finish with the presentation. So I'll hand it back to you, Jonathan.
Neil, thanks very much for that. And now straight on to you, Ellen, to get to the meat of it, which is how you guys applied the protocol on that particular project. Over to you.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. So yeah, I'm Ellen Upton. I'm a principal consultant at Thesis Group. And I'd just like to give you a really quick introduction to Thesis, just in case you haven't heard of us before. So we're a specialist sustainability consultancy, and we combine technical advice with technology and managed services. And underpinning a lot of the work that we do is the belief that commercial success and sustainability need to go hand in hand. Since our inception in October 2013, we've now grown to 150 people, and that's based across the UK, the US, Germany, China, the Philippines and Dubai. And we've been fortunate enough to work with Natural Capital Partners for a number of years now, mainly working on greenhouse gas and sustainability work for a number of corporate organisations. Next slide. Thanks. So I'll get into our experiences with the protocol. So our approach. Now, as Neil alluded to before, we've been so fortunate to work with the Paradigm Project, because if it wasn't for their involvement in the carbon markets and their very detailed data collection, this process would have been really, really difficult. So starting from the beginning, we worked through the protocol stage by stage, and we starting with the why. So this was really important to help set out the context of looking at natural capital, and it set the expectations for what the output should be. The next stage is scoping, or the what. So this is where we identified and prioritised the important areas of focus. Next is followed by the how. So it's measuring and valuing the natural capital indicators in ways that are really meaningful for the organisational project that's being evaluated. And finally, the so what. So what does this all mean for the organisation and project, and how will it be used? So the protocol, and that's as we work through it, and we understand that it's going through a few changes following the consultation process. It's a 10-stage process, and it's got a lot of guidance on different ways of evaluating natural capital. We decided to break it down into a quick start spreadsheet, which helps simplify the stages and break it up into digestible pieces, which we found much, much easier to manage. So next slide. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of the results that we found. So as we worked through the protocol with Paradigm Partners, we identified 3 core impacts that the Cookstove project was having. These were reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, reduction in fuel consumption, and improvement in indoor air quality for the users of the cookstoves. We found there were additional social benefits that could be directly attributed to the cookstoves, but for the purposes of this pilot, we decided to focus on the environmental benefits, as they could be more accurately monitored and reported. For each of these core impacts, we then identified several indicators to each of these, as outlined in the protocol. So for greenhouse gas emissions, they were reduction in the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but also slowing the contribution to climate change. For fuel consumption, we looked at biodiversity and soil erosion. And indoor air quality, we looked at air pollution and health costs for the family and community that are actually using the cookstoves. We then applied a number of different metrics to each of the indicators to assign a dollar value to each. And then the overall aim of the project is to get a figure of $1 spent with the Cookstove project to equal a number of dollars benefit. Next slide. So as we work through the protocol, and as with any new standard, we did encounter some challenges. And the most significant was being access to data. So if Paradigm Project hadn't already gathered a lot of this impact data of the Cookstove projects, collating and auditing it would have been a really lengthy process. And so for an organisation without this information, it would be a relatively large undertaking in terms of time and expense. We also found that the protocol does well to help users understand, evaluate and prioritise areas for activity, but without the specialist support available to help with the implementation, it could be quite challenging. Next slide. But as with challenges, there comes great opportunity. So we're already working with a number of businesses in this area and believe that the standard will serve to improve recognition of the activities undertaken and address the impacts and wider benefits that an organisation might have. In addition, it helps to deliver a deep understanding of the benefits. So this could be things like risk management or cost saving, or it could be some of the more intangible social parameters such as brand value or reputation. The process is also really important to help quantify the direct and indirect benefits returned to a community that would normally be really, really hard to evidence. So as a process, the protocol is a really powerful lever for quantifying and monetising the wider benefits of a business or a project. So to finish off, we've developed a couple of key lessons from our experience in putting the protocol to use with Paradigm partners. Now the first one is you need to really clearly set out the objectives of your assessment, and this will help define the question that you want to answer and focus the time spent in doing so. Next, you want to ensure that the assessment really does fit in with your usual business decision-making processes, so that's how you value different parts of your business, and it'll help you focus the business case when you're engaging with the decision makers once you've got your outcome. It's really important to have a cross-functional team to feed into the assessment, because this helps cover things like finance and stakeholder engagement, operations, etc., and helps diversify the answers that you're going to get. And when you do come across natural capital impacts that go beyond your usual scope or control, so in the short term we suggest excluding them, but then setting up a process for including them in the scope in the future. And one really key message is that if you're already doing something, use the process that you've already got and adapt it if needed. Don't create something from scratch. We also found that some of the assessment types, they do require some specific skills. That's mainly around the measurement and valuation sections of the process. So identifying the right methodology and quantifying the impact, and then also auditing the results, might be worth accessing some specialist support. So that's it from me. And I think I'll pass back on over to Jonathan.
Right. Thank you very much. Now we've had a couple of questions come through. We've got about 4 and plenty of time. So if you are sitting on any questions, please ping them through, as I mentioned, by using the questions box on your screen, and don't forget to press send. So the first one will probably be for you, Mark. The question is really about the future and the structure of the sector guides. What do you have in, I think the best way to paraphrase it is, what do you have in the works, and what might they, when might they come to market, and how will they be different to the generic guide? Have we got on? Yeah, over to you, Mark.
Yeah. Thank you, Jonathan. So the sector guides follow exactly the same format, so the stages and steps of the protocol, and cannot be taken alone. They have to be done in concert with the protocol. So the 2 that we are launching with the protocol are, there's one on apparel and one on food and beverage sectors. And they will be launched on the 13th of July. We are already starting to look at other sector guides, and the way that we are doing this is that we're open to conversations with sector initiatives. We're not talking to individual organizations. We don't want to go about setting up new different institutions and organizations to try and develop natural capital when there's already sector initiatives in place. So we are working through those sector initiatives that are already established to then develop a sector guide with them that will be suitable for their sector. The first one that we are looking at is the real estate sector, and we are working with a couple of the initiatives in that space. We're also, as I mentioned, looking at a finance sector guide as well, working with financial institutions and their particular relationship with natural capital and with business. We are, though, like I say, open to further conversations, so if anyone on the call is interested in a guide that would be more relevant to their sector, then going through their sector initiatives that they're involved with and getting in contact with us, we're very open to conversations there.
Thanks, Mark. I'm selecting these as we to spread them around a bit. Neil, the process for collecting source data that you talked to, sort of highlighted in terms of the carbon finance aspects of your project. Can you say a bit more about that? How did that work? Where does the data come from? What's your process for collecting it?
Yeah, I think that's a really important aspect of going through the protocol, and something that you need to go into with your eyes wide open as you attempt to approach this. Ellen's comment, I will just support wholeheartedly that I would highly recommend a third party to go along on this journey with you, somebody who understands the protocol and can help you manage it, if for no other reason than to keep you on task and to help get from one stage to the next. It's extremely thorough, which is what makes it valuable, but it can be difficult to do. And we're a small company, so I think larger companies who would have the ability to apply dedicated resources or a team internally may be able to tackle this with minimal external help, but it does take quite a bit of time and energy. To give you an example of the kind of data collection that we already had, we currently employ 4 full-time monitoring and evaluation specialists who are essentially monitoring 50 weeks of the year, literally traveling from household to household in the areas that we work, doing interviews, doing some field testing, gathering that data and analyzing that data, and then we go through, for each of our different programs, an annual audit from a firm that's in carbon language called a designated operating entity. They're sanctioned and approved by the UN and essentially come in and they do an audit that is similar to a financial audit, but it covers all aspects of the program. They want to look at our books, our paperwork, and they actually want to visit homes where we sell products to speak to the homeowners to confirm that the data that we're collecting is accurate. So I would say 75% or so of the data that we needed to be able to go through this we already had in hand, and we would have been talking about several thousand man-hours to collect that data had we not had it already in hand.
Thanks. Ellen, I have one for you that's come down the line, and it is really about, I know it's going to be a tough one to answer, how long do you think a project should allow to measure its positive natural capital impact, or what are the defining factors in sort of figuring out the length of time you need to account for?
I think that really depends on the depth at which you want to go into investigating your natural capital, and also the time available that you have, I think, and the output that you want. So you could do a light touch natural capital assessment, and I think the protocol really does lend itself to doing either a very, very in-depth one or a light touch as well. You can follow the stages through pretty easily, and you can get an answer you want. It depends on the data that you've got around your impacts. I think if you can define your core impacts and then the indicators, then it will help give you a better answer on how long it's going to take. Trying to give a more specific answer, it's very difficult depending on the type of organisation that you are. I would say break it up into chunks. Start off with identifying your indicators, and then that will make the process a lot easier. Sorry, that's not very precise.
No, maybe I'll come back to Mark on that and say, Mark, as I recall, the Coalition's primary goal in developing the protocol was as a strategic aid, or an aid to strategic decision-making within corporates. So double question, I'll pick up a few on this. In picking up the last question that I put to Ellen, how much time, do you have a view on how the protocol is primarily being put to use? Is it as a conceptual thinking guide to wrap your arms around natural capital? Are people tending to go deep dive, into full evaluations like Puma, or are they doing some lighter touches, as Ellen suggested, to begin to frame some of the challenges of natural capital? Could you say something about those, those aspects?
So we have found that there is a very big range of different reasons why people pick up the protocol. We've set out within the protocol business applications, what it might be applied for, and the majority of these is an overriding view around risk and opportunity, which isn't that surprising. But it really is a very broad spectrum, and that's one of the strengths of this, I think, and actually it shouldn't be seen as a downside. Actually, it can be picked up for very many different reasons. And we've been seeing that through the piloting and through the contact we're now having with more organizations that want to use it. Most of the organizations that come to us, though, do come with a very specific need. So they will come to us with a particular issue in their supply chain, something around an option appraisal, or they want to be looking at their total impact that they have, and often they'll be coming with that specific question. So they know there's something that's been going on in their business. They just haven't quite worked out how to address it or how to systemize it, get it into their strategy, and then connect that back down to their operations. So it's about that. They know what the problem is a lot of the time, but not quite how to address it. And the protocol sets out a standardized framework for being able to incorporate that in. We have, in the latest version, which you'll be seeing, which comes out on July the 13th, tried to address that question of resources. We have put in some indicators showing sort of an idea on the amount of cost and the amount of time it would take. Obviously, as Ellen was saying, it's going to be really specific based upon the decision you're trying to inform. But there are some things, such as if you use a value transfer method, that will obviously be much easier than using proprietary data and will take less time. So we've been able to identify some of those to give some indication, but that was very difficult and took a long time of people coming together to try and identify that. But hopefully that will be helpful when you see the final version when it is launched in July.
Thanks, Mark. Look, I'm going to pick up a question that's come up and probably picking up on the fact that as I introduced the webinar, I talked about our experiences with carbon offset projects, and the question really is, best way of communicating natural capital and offsetting to those within businesses who may be skeptical of it, as a view, as a compensating mechanism or syntax in 2 words. So I would like to say that, Mark, just picking up on what you've said, it's the way in which corporations are using this as a tool. In some instances, in our experience, natural capital protocol and those approaches are being used to understand a corporation's impact, negative and potentially positive, on natural capital assets. Carbon offsetting and then the co-benefits that Neil spoke about on the clean cook stoves, many of the additional attributes that play into the natural capital space are useful to corporations that may have identified areas where there is a negative impact and where they do want to intervene using a project-based approach to redress negative impacts or to rehabilitate natural capital assets upon which they depend, whether that be a river, a biodiverse area that supplies pollination or whatever. So in that context of using these mechanisms to support strategic goals of a business, I think it steps right out of many of the controversies of the early days of offsetting as to whether you're buying your way out of a problem. In every instance, I think the natural capital benefits of carbon offset projects and the whole concept of using natural capital to prioritize your actions sort of keeps us is what has allowed, I think, the Natural Capital Coalition to grow its membership so strongly, so rapidly, and so large. There is a question, Neil, that I'm going to pop your way, probably a more detailed data collection one. When attempting to address issues around gender equality, how would you recommend addressing quite cultural context-specific issues around gender without causing resentment or concern within household and community levels? So, Neil, that might be a wider question. You know, many of the things that you're investigating have challenges, particularly in with issues like gender or poverty. How do you guys tend to approach those?
Yeah, that's I think, a really insightful question, because we work in a wide variety of countries, all of which have, you know, varying degrees of understanding and cultural acceptance in terms of women's roles. So I think you can, one of the beautiful things about the Natural Capital Protocol is that there's a lot of room to define how you want to measure things. And when, from our perspective, when we look at gender equality, we're looking at very basic forms of empowering or improving women's lives. So we're, in our particular case, very little of what we are measuring and quantifying is politically charged or politically related within the cultural context that we work. So to give you an example, one of the things that we do in selling efficient stoves is we alleviate the time burden on women in some countries. In our Central American project, it's the men who are responsible for collecting wood. In Africa, it's almost exclusively women and girls who collect wood, and that has two major impacts. One is just general time available to do other things within the household or to utilize for herself. Two is that for girls, if the burden is high enough, they are sometimes taken out of school or pulled from school early to be able to help their mothers, you know, collect that wood. So that's one example of how we're measuring gender equality in our work. And I think there are many ways that you could look at that, but because of the nature of our work, most of what we're measuring is more tangible and physical enablement of women, in addition to offering women opportunities for good paying jobs and a few other things that, again, I would consider very basic rights, but none of which are in any way, as I said, politically charged within the cultures that we're working. If we were working in more in North Africa or within some of the states or the countries where some of the religious freedoms are far fewer with regard to women, we might see things like employing women become a very sensitive area. But it's not something that we've had to do a lot of wrestling with in terms of what we're measuring through the protocol.
Thank you. Thanks. Probably our final question, if I judge the time. And, well, actually probably to Ellen and to Mark. Mark, I think the comments that you made is that, you know, the Natural Capital Protocol, if I'm paraphrasing the question, is about process, and we've talked a lot about the availability of data. What initiatives do you see evolving to develop, you know, the sector, not just guides, but the databases that people can then access without having to go as much to source data? So Mark, if I could start with you, and then Ellen, you might have a view on that, given the work you did on this exercise.
So there are several obviously significant databases that are used already for information, and I think part of the problem isn't that there isn't information available, it's about accessing it and knowing how reliable it is. The Natural Capital Project, one of the coalition organizations, is at the moment trying to harness a lot of this information and has a project which it is working on with several of the other coalition organizations around creating a more significant data depository. The work that the coalition is going to be doing isn't going to be around the database as such with all the information, but we are trying to bring together once again the system to look at what constitutes, what are the challenges with this. And as we've seen, as Eleanor and others have been saying, from the piloting, it is the primary concern that's come out, I think, from the piloting, not so much about following the process of the protocol, but where do they get access to good, bad data to be able to and understand the quality of that data, and questions such as, proprietary, who's funding the data, whether they're using open access data, those sort of questions. So we will be bringing together a group of people through the coalition to explore this over the next year or so, and identifying what that sort of framework, the rules of engagement around data should be.
Thank you. Ellen, is there anything you'd like to add to that based on your hands-on experience there?
I think, for the initial users of the protocol, there's going to be more time invested in getting that data, but as it becomes perhaps more mainstream, more people use it, and there becomes a database of indicators that can be used and proxy data that can be used when you can't find bespoke information on your project or your organisation, then it will be, the whole process will become a lot smoother, a lot quicker, and then organisations can realise the benefits a lot quicker and more efficiently. So I think it's just about getting those databases up and running, and using proxy data if needed.
Great, thank you. I think that we probably draw this the webinar to a close now, and I'd like to thank panelists very much, Mark, Neil, and Ellen, for your insights. Thank you very much to all of you who've attended and for your questions. We're making a recording of the webinar, and it will be available on our website as of next week. All of us would very much welcome your feedback. I think this is a fantastic voyage of exploration, and of course we'd be happy to answer any questions and to hear from you if you'd like more information about any of the organization's services. On the last slide you've got all the contact details of the speakers this afternoon. So we are going to close the webinar now, and just finally, once again, thank you so much for attending.